If you think you learned everything about the Declaration of Independence from high school or National Treasure, you would be wrong. The most iconic piece of writing in American history has had an interesting life. It hasn't just been sitting in a museum for 200 years. In this episode of Intrigued Mind, we'll be taking a look at the history of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was the first step America took towards becoming the United States of America. Alongside the Constitution, it is the most iconic and influential piece of writing in the history of the United States. You may think you learned all of the secrets about the Declaration of Independence from Nicolas Cage in National Treasure, but there's still a lot you don't know about this famous text. Enough to fill an 8-minute YouTube video, in fact. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the document is that it was not actually signed on the 4th of July in 1776. On July 1st, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, and on July 2nd, 12 of the 13 colonies voted in favor of independence. The delegates from New York were the only ones who didn't vote. This was because their colony's provincial congress was slow in approving the decision. Not because they were really against the declaration. Information moved much slower when the fastest way to send someone an update was on a horse. The next 2 days were spent debating and changing the exact language of the Declaration. On July 4th, Congress officially adopted the Declaration, and that's why it's celebrated as Independence Day. But it wouldn't actually be signed for almost a month. They had to wait for New York, and they also had to wait for the Declaration to be engrossed. This meant having a copy that was written on parchment in clear handwriting, which was an issue before typewriters and printing presses were instantly accessible. Most of the delegates actually signed on August 2nd. Some of the delegates, John Dickinson and Robert Livingston, never actually signed at all. According to legend, John Hancock signed his name in extra-large handwriting so that King George III would be able to see it without his spectacles. This is why his last name, Hancock, is sometimes used as a word for signature. The oldest person to sign the document was Benjamin Franklin, who was 70 years old at the time. The youngest signer was 44 years younger than him. Edward Rutledge, a lawyer from South Carolina, was 26 when he signed. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the final draft, was 33. This means that he couldn't even legally be president today, because you need to be at least 35 for that. There is more than one copy of the Declaration. After it was officially adopted, the so-called Committee of Five, made up of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston, were put in charge of reproducing the approved version. A print shop in Philadelphia, owned by a man named John Dunlap, created the first copies, which are now known as Dunlap broadsides. They were sent to newspapers, local officials, and troop commanders in all 13 colonies. When one of the Dunlap broadsides reached New York City, it ended up setting off a riot. Hundreds of British naval ships were occupying New York Harbor, which was creating a lot of tension and causing people to think that a revolution was a good idea. British troops being stationed in the colonies was one of the major issues that sparked the Declaration in the first place. George Washington, who was the commander of the Continental Forces at the time, read Jefferson's words out loud in front of City Hall. The crowd that was listening to him was so hyped that they tore down the nearest statue of King George III. The statue would later be melted down and turned into over 42,000 musket balls that would be shot at the British by the American Army during the Revolutionary War. It really doesn't get much more American than that. Today, the Dunlap broadsides are very rare and valuable historical artifacts. It's thought that hundreds were printed on the night of July 4th, but only 26 copies are currently known to have survived. Most of them are in museums or libraries, but 3 are privately owned. In 1989, a Dunlap broadside was randomly found by someone at a flea market in Philadelphia. It was hidden in the back of a picture frame and in near perfect condition, despite being 213 years old. They bought it for $4. It was later sold for $8.1 million. Another lost Dunlap broadside was discovered at the British National Archives in 2009. It had remained hidden for centuries in a box of papers that had been captured from American colonists during the Revolutionary War. It may seem weird that such an iconic piece of American history is kept in England, but perhaps the Founding Fathers themselves wouldn't see things that way. Most of the members of the Second Continental Congress were born in the colonies, but 8 of them were actually born in the United Kingdom. 2 were from England, 2 were from Scotland, 2 were from Ireland, 1 was from Northern Ireland, and 1 was from Wales. I guess they can be forgiven for being a little bit British, seeing as how America didn't even exist as a country yet. Richard Stockton, who was a lawyer from Princeton, New Jersey, ended up being the only signer to take back his support for the revolution. Not any of the guys who had been born outside the colonies. It wasn't really his true belief that the Declaration had been a mistake, however. On November 30th of 1776, he was captured by the British and imprisoned for his involvement with the revolution. He was stuck there for months and given the bare minimum of food. He officially recanted his signature on the Declaration of Independence and swore his allegiance to King George III in order to get them to release him. When the British finally did let him go about a year later, he took a new oath of loyalty to the state of New Jersey to make up for it. Currently, the original Declaration of Independence is on display in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It is open to the public, and anyone who wants to can go and take a look. But before settling down, it had quite a life on the road. After the signing ceremony, it was most likely filed away in Philadelphia. During the Revolutionary War, it moved around with the Continental Congress. It was stored rolled up and was unrolled whenever it needed to be used. It traveled by wagon, horseback, and boat. In 1800, it was taken to Washington, D.C., but it soon had to be moved again to avoid being captured by the British during the War of 1812. They moved it to an out-of-use mill in Virginia to hide it. After the British were done burning down the White House and acting uncivilized, it was returned to the Capitol. It has only left the Capitol twice since that time. Once was for a trip to Philadelphia to be in the Centennial International Exhibition in 1876 to celebrate America's 100th birthday. This was the first World's Fair to be held in the United States, and the official, amazingly 19th century name was the International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of the Soil and Mine. The Declaration wasn't the only thing that people could go and see at this fair. This was also where Alexander Graham Bell's telephone and HEINZ ketchup were first displayed to the public, whose minds, I'm sure, were blown. The second and final time the Declaration of Independence has left D.C. was on December 23, 1941. This was 16 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Declaration, along with the Constitution, were removed from public display and evacuated out of the Capitol under the close supervision of an armed guard. It was placed in a specially designed container, latched shut with padlocks, sealed with lead, and then placed into a separate, larger box. 150 pounds of protective gear surrounded the piece of parchment. They really weren't taking any chances. It got on a train with Secret Service agents and traveled to Louisville, Kentucky, where a cavalry troop of the 13th Armored Division escorted it into Fort Knox. The Declaration was returned to Washington, D.C. in 1944 when they were confident that the coast was clear. By that time, it was safely assumed that the Axis powers had much bigger problems on their hands than launching a secret mission to destroy the Declaration. In the iconic movie National Treasure, Nicolas Cage's character, Ben Franklin Gates, claims that there is a secret treasure map on the back of the Declaration. It has encrypted instructions from the Founding Fathers that they wrote in invisible ink. Sadly, this is not a real thing. There is, however, really something written on the back of the Declaration of Independence. Written upside down across the bottom of the back of the page, it says, "Original Declaration of Independence, dated 4th July, 1776. Nobody knows who wrote this or when they wrote this." It's thought that this text was added to the parchment as a label, since it was frequently rolled up to be stored for transport and wouldn't otherwise have been easily recognizable. It's possible that it was added by Charles Thomson, Secretary of the Continental Congress, since in the early years of the document's existence, he was usually the one holding onto it. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.